Reptile keeping is a thriving hobby, but it hasn't always looked the way it does today. In fact, the way we house them, breed them, and even think about them as pets has been shaped by just a handful of species. Some of these reptiles became icons of the hobby with their bright new colours and easy accessibility. Others, on the other hand, were total disasters, invading territories and even prompting new laws. Today, we're counting down the 5 reptiles that changed the hobby forever, for better and for worse. Let's get into it. So let's start big. Burmese python big. Now, in the 70s, when exotic pets were basically unregulated in the UK, Burmese pythons became the poster child for "look how cool my pet is." Pet shops around the country were selling them to anyone with cash in their hand. But that adorable 2-foot hatchling? Yeah, in a few years it's a 15-foot monster that eats rabbits for breakfast. And in the UK, people were totally unprepared. Imagine buying a goldfish and 2 years later it's a great white shark. That's basically what happened to the majority of people. In other words, Burmese pythons forced the UK to take reptile keeping seriously. Unfortunately, other parts of the world didn't get away quite so lightly. Florida, for example, ended up with one of the worst invasive species problems in the world.
I mean, there is no safe place in South Florida tonight. These winds exceed the building code.
This is literally a painful experience. This sand is hitting us so hard that it feels like BB's hitting your skin.
What we come out of our houses to tomorrow afternoon is going to be very frightening.
In 1992, Hurricane Andrew destroyed reptile breeding facilities, releasing a number of large snakes, including Burmese pythons, directly into the Everglades. The Everglades offered the perfect conditions. It's warm, humid, and full of prey. With no natural predators and an abundance of food available, the pythons thrived. They quickly established a breeding population. By the early 2000s, scientists confirmed the snakes weren't just surviving, they were reproducing in huge numbers. Today, despite attempts to control the population, there's an estimated 30 to 100,000 Burmese pythons in Florida. They've damn near eradicated populations of birds, rabbits, and even deer. They didn't just change reptile keeping, they changed whole ecosystems. The Burmese python taught us a hard truth. Just because you can own a giant snake doesn't mean you should. Yeah, maybe don't impulse buy something that could one day outgrow your sofa. Next up, on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, the corn snake. When most people think about starting with snakes, one species usually comes to mind, the corn snake. They're calm, colourful and relatively small, making them the perfect beginner snake. But their influence goes a long way beyond just being easy to keep. Corn snakes literally shaped modern reptile keeping. Corn snakes hit the hobby at just the right time. In the 1980s and 90s, exotic reptiles were gaining popularity, but many species were wild caught or difficult to care for. Corn snakes were different. They stayed manageable about 4 to 6 feet, were non-aggressive, easy to feed, and tolerated handling remarkably well. For new keepers, they were the ideal introduction, proving that snakes could be accessible, safe, and enjoyable pets. But here's the real game changer. It was one of the first reptiles to be consistently bred in captivity. Back in the 1970s, most reptiles in the pet trade were still wild caught, often stressed, parasite-ridden and difficult to care for, and generally had quite short lifespans. Corn snakes, however, proved that breeding reptiles in captivity was not only possible, but it was better for both animals and owners. Suddenly you could get healthy, captive-bred babies, and eventually in every colour you could dream of. That's right, not long after came the morph explosion. Albino corn snakes appeared in the 1960s, and by the 80s and 90s, keepers were selectively breeding for a rainbow of colours and patterns. Suddenly, reptile keeping wasn't just about owning an exotic pet. It became about genetics, selective breeding, and one could argue, almost artistry.
Now, right up in here, we'll make a happy little cloud.
And this trend didn't just stay with the corn snakes. It opened the floodgates for the entire reptile morph industry, from ball pythons to leopard geckos. Basically, if you've ever stared at that £5,000 sunset clown banana firefly ball python, you can thank the humble corn snake. So the corn snake shaped reptile keeping by proving that captive bred reptiles were healthier, more sustainable, and all round just better. In many ways, the corn snake turned reptile keeping from a niche into a mainstream hobby. Right, let's switch to lizards, and specifically the leopard gecko. Now, if you ask reptile keepers from the 1990s what their first lizard was, chances are it was one of these guys. Why? Well, because leopard geckos are small, they're hardy, and let's be honest, they're just so damn adorable. Like corn snakes, leopard geckos thrived in captivity. They bred readily, they don't require massive enclosures, and they tolerate handling super well. For many, this was the reptile that made lizard keeping accessible to beginners. But here's why they're important. Leopard geckos made reptiles approachable. Parents who would never say yes to a snake were suddenly cool with this cute little lizard. They turned reptiles from this scary niche into a mainstream pet option. They helped the hobby shed its dangerous image. Leopard geckos also sparked the first real lizard morph craze. Albinos appeared in the 1990s, followed by a flood of morphs like blizzards, tangerines, eclipses, and all kinds of other stupid names.
Hang on, what did he just say?
Suddenly, reptile shops were awash with leopard geckos in every colour of the rainbow. The morph craze reshaped the hobby. It showed people that reptiles could be just as collectible and diverse as things like birds or tropical fish. But leopard geckos did more than just sell in numbers. They also taught us about proper husbandry. They needed heating, hides, the right diet. And later we realised that UV lighting was beneficial too. As more and more people kept them, the UK hobby began standardising things like substrate choices, supplementation and enclosure design. In other words, leopard geckos pushed reptile keeping towards responsibility and education. They were easy, but they weren't throwaway pets. They helped prove that reptiles could be cared for long term, not just treated as the occasional novelty. Today, leopard geckos are everywhere in the hobby. They're the starter pet that grew into a staple, the lizard that taught us about captive breeding, and the reptile that helped launch the morph industry. Without leopard geckos, reptile keeping in Britain would look completely different. They weren't just another lizard, they were a turning point that shaped the way we keep reptiles. Now, if leopard geckos open the door to mainstream lizards, our next reptile almost slammed it shut again. Let's talk about the green iguana. Back in the 80s and 90s, if you walked into a pet shop looking for a lizard, chances are you'd find a tank full of bright green iguanas. They were cheap, they were exotic, and they looked just like miniature dinosaurs. What more could you want? For a lot of people, the green iguana was their first introduction to reptile keeping. But here's the thing. The green iguana ended up teaching the reptile world the true meaning of buyer's remorse. Imported by the thousands from Central and South America, baby iguanas were sold for just a few pounds each in the UK. They were colourful, active, and way more impressive than a corn snake or a leopard gecko. The problem though? Nobody told customers that those cute 6-inch lizards would grow into 5-foot giants with powerful claws, tails like whips, and a real serious attitude. What started as the cool pet lizard quickly became a nightmare for owners who weren't prepared. As these animals grew, most keepers realised they didn't have the space, knowledge, or resources to care for them properly. Iguanas need massive enclosures, a precise diet rich in calcium, intense heat and UV lighting, and years of consistent handling to stay tame. Without all that, they became aggressive, malnourished, and often sick. Across the UK, rescues started filling up with unwanted iguanas. In the public eye, the flood of abandoned iguanas damaged the reputation of the reptile hobby. It forced the community to prove that reptile keeping could be responsible and sustainable. Suddenly, keepers had to ask themselves tough questions. Is this species really suitable for the average owner? What kind of enclosure is actually appropriate? And how do we educate new keepers before they buy? The answers led a shift in the entire hobby. Care guides improved and pet shops became more cautious about what they sold and who they sold them to. Today, green iguanas are still around, but they're no longer the cheap, trendy pet of the past. Instead, they stand as a reminder for how far reptile keeping has come. They taught us the importance of research. They forced us to think about enclosure size, long-term commitment, and whether every species belongs in the average home. In short, the green iguana shaped reptile keeping by showing us what not to do, and by pushing the hobby to just grow up. And finally, the tiny turtle that caused chaos across the UK, terrapins. Now, if you lived in Britain in the 90s, you probably remember seeing them in pet shops. Sweet, tiny shells floating in little bowls, sold as the perfect children's pet. Cute? Absolutely. Practical? Not even close. Back then, terrapins such as the red-eared slider were considered the ultimate easy pet. I mean, look at it. It's not like you need a huge cage or anything, just a small, simple bowl will do. Hundreds upon thousands were imported into the UK from the United States and Europe. Everyone wanted one, and that's where the trouble started. Because most people had no idea how big, messy, or long-lived animals these are. You see, terrapins don't stay cute and tiny forever. Most, if not all owners were completely oblivious to the fact that most animals grew over 30 centimetres and could live for up to 40 years. They need heated water, UV lighting, good filtration, and a carefully balanced diet. Most terrapins sold to kids, however, ended up in tiny tanks, bowls or ponds without any filtration. They had poor diets and unhygienic conditions. This meant illness and premature death was incredibly common. It taught the UK hobbyists the hard way that even the smallest reptile can demand some serious care. Terrapins also became infamous for their role in invasive species problems. Owners who couldn't cope or simply didn't want to deal with a growing messy reptile often released them into ponds, canals and rivers. Terrapins in particular thrived in the UK's mild climate. They outcompeted native turtles, disrupted ecosystems and became a serious environmental concern. Even today you'll see them sunbathing in ponds where they don't belong. This led to awareness campaigns and stricter rules around releasing exotic animals, lessons that shaped how we regulate reptiles today. The terrapin craze also changed how the public saw reptiles. Suddenly it wasn't just snakes or lizards causing concern. Tiny, seemingly harmless turtles could create massive problems if kept irresponsibly. In short, terrapins highlighted that every reptile, no matter how small or cute, has specific needs, and that failure to meet them can have consequences for the people, the pets, and the environment. Today, terrapins are still popular, but most keepers are far more informed. UV lamps, filtration, proper diets, long-term commitment are now standard for any serious owner. Terrapins taught the UK reptile hobby 3 key lessons. Small doesn't mean simple. Even the smallest reptiles can require decades of care. Responsibility matters. Releasing pets into the wild has real consequences. And finally, education is key. Proper guidance from shops and clubs prevents problems before they start. For better or worse, terrapins shaped how we approach reptile keeping in Britain, turning what was once a cute novelty into a serious reptile hobby. So there you have it, 5 reptiles that shaped the UK reptile hobby. The Burmese python brought new, stricter laws. The corn snake brought colourful morphs. The leopard gecko brought accessibility to more keepers. The iguana brought harsh lessons in responsibility. And the terrapin, well, it brought total chaos. Which of these do you think had the biggest impact on reptile keeping? Have you ever spotted a wild terrapin in your local pond? Let me know in the comments below. Hit like if you enjoyed this video, and don't forget to subscribe for more videos coming real soon. They bred readily, they don't require massive enclosures, and they handle tolerance? No, that's not a sentence.